we need to talk about unions. So many people will tell new builders in Roblox Studio that unions are bad, but they never really explain why. So let's change that today, shall we? First, let's start off with what a union is. Here we've got Roblox Studio, and we're going to start by throwing down a part. And these are all the basic parts that we have available to us. However, with these parts, you can put them intersecting with another part. Go to the model tab in the top here, and then set it to negate. And then union. And you can create a cutout. Very useful, right? So why are unions bad? Here I have a list of reasons why unions are bad. The first reason? Weird collisions. If you've ever played Roblox before, you'll know that there's some weird behavior that can happen with unions. For example, that hole there works perfectly fine, but if I try to do the same thing in this hole here, for some reason I'm not falling through. Why is that? When you create a new union, the collision is a separate mesh to the one that you see in front of you. And there is a way to see this mesh. If you go to File, Studio Settings, or just press Alt-S, and then in here you want to go down to Studio, scroll all the way down to Visualization, and then enable Show Decomposition Geometry. This is showing you what the actual collision meshes look like for all of your models. For example, that perfectly smooth sphere cutout that you saw earlier, well, the collision isn't exactly quite that accurate. And if you look at the union that I was interacting with before, you'll see that the collision doesn't quite actually match up with the shape of the model itself. In fact, you see the hole I was trying to go through is actually completely blocked off for some reason. This is because Roblox Studio default collision meshes are quite bad. Luckily, you can actually change it away from the default. If you click on the union with the weird collision and open your properties tab, if you don't see properties or explorer, I highly suggest you click view at the top here, and then you click explorer and properties. Without them, you don't see them. Just make sure you have both of them because you use them a lot. In your properties tab, you want to scroll all the way down after clicking on the union, the culprit, and it should say near at the bottom there, collision fidelity. Right now it's set to default. In fact, all unions have it set to default by default. The only problem with that is that default not very precise. Luckily, we have a setting called precise convex decomposition. If you change it to that, all of a sudden, the collision actually matches it a lot more accurately. So if we play test, you can see that I can actually fit through that hole now. So let's take this setting to Archipelago, an old version of Archipelago, version 2.1. If I press Alt-S to open up this menu again, or you can just use File, Studio Settings. Rather than looking for it manually, I'm just going to type in comp at the top. That takes me straight to it and turn it back on. You'll see the collision for the map. Now you'll notice that these arches aren't quite arches, they're more this weird shape, but that doesn't matter, that's outside of the playable space. These barrels have a weird flat top to them for some reason, not too sure why that is. You know, there's a lot of stuff in here. What on earth is this? What on earth is that? Oh, it's the fountain. Huh? What am I looking at here? What is this? So this is collision, you can collide with this. Is this... yeah, you know, I forgot about this. Yeah, so this was in the map actually at one point in time. If we turn off show decomposition, do you see what I mean? That is just... why is the collision like that? What the hell? Okay. Yeah, so that's a prime example of what can happen with union collision. Okay. Luckily, obviously, you know, a easy fix here would be to change the collision fidelity to... I mean, Box fixes it, or at least mostly fixes it, though I imagine it will probably still stick out the walls. Hull works a lot better. Hull's pretty good. Or if I needed to be precise, I could use that, but to be honest, mate, if I was... this is just a terrible union. This is awful. So, what's the second problem with unions? Well, the second issue is unnecessary tries. Over here, we have an example of two identical looking parts. I'm going to fly around them so you know that they are identical. And they are. However, there's a problem. This is a part, while this is a union. Even though this union looks exactly the same as that part, there is some hidden stuff hiding under the surface, and we can spot this ourselves. If you head up to the View tab at the top and then click on Wireframe Rendering, all of a sudden your world will begin to look like this. This is how the game engine sees all of the triangles that your world is made up of. So, for example, terrain is a whole bunch of triangles, and if you fly away from the terrain, you'll actually see the triangles get bigger and bigger as it enters a lower detail or an LOD of the terrain. That's why terrain tends to look worse and worse the further away you are from it, because the level of detail is snapping along these sort of chunk grids, as you can see. You see these two parts? This is what the part looks like. It's quite simple. One triangle here, and then one triangle there. Same for this side, same for that side, same for this side. Very simple, very basic. 2 triangles per square face, which means that parts by default are quite performative. You can place hundreds to thousands of parts in a world, and if it's just the default block part or a wedge of some kind, that's not going to lag your game at all. It's going to work perfectly fine. So what's going on here? If you look, you'll notice that the top face of this union, I don't know how visible this is, but that's quite a lot of extra triangles. In fact, it's so bad on the top here, all of these extraneous extra vertices and points and lines and triangles, there's probably like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's got to be like 30 or something triangles on the top of here for no reason. Well, if I show you how this union was created, separate, you'll see the culprit. It's basically just I took a bunch of negative bricks and chopped off the top, and that created a lot of extra intersections in the union. And because that top face has a lot of extra triangles, it's bled over into the side faces having duplicate triangles too. This side face doesn't need all these extra triangles, and nor does this back need to have that many triangles as well. So imagine I took this union and I duplicated it just a couple of times, right? You know, maybe it was like some kind of structural support pillar that I was using in a building. Now if we turn on wireframe rendering, you start to understand those triangles add up really freaking fast. So whenever you create a union, make sure that you check its wireframe before you think you're finished using it, because sometimes you might have created it with a lot of faults inherent in the design, and wireframe rendering can help you identify that. There's something I really quickly want to show you guys, and that's a concept I want to introduce to you guys called floating point inaccuracy. You might know that inside of every part it has a size and it has a position. Now the position of this part's actually quite good, right? It's, you know, whole integer numbers, 39, there's no decimal places except for this 0.5, right? That's fine. Sometimes what you goobers like to do is move stuff on a 0 stud increment, or with this move thing unselected up here. And then you'll just move this, move this, move that. I have now introduced 3 decimal places of extra positional information into all of the axes of this brick. I'm going to show you why it can be a problem. Let's take this part and let's make a union out of it. I'm going to grab an extra brick and I'm going to convert this into a cylinder. There we go, we've got a cylinder here. And I want to make a little arch, kind of like the ones in Archipelago. So we're going to cut this out. In fact, I'm going to move this down 0.5 so that the seam of this cylinder is perfectly in line with there. Nice, nice, nice. And I'm just going to extrude it out this side just a little bit. All right, cool. I'm going to set this to negate, and then I'm going to union this together. Perfect, right? Wait a minute, what's going on back there? Huh, I seem to have created an infinitesimally small lip. When I moved this part into that really random location, I introduced something called floating point inaccuracy. Now, if you've heard of the 32-bit integer limit, or the 64-bit integer limit, or whatever limit it might be, you know that there's only a certain amount of numbers a model or a computing engine can store before it just has a meltdown. Now, normally this isn't a problem because it can store quite a lot of numbers. For example, it could store 1 followed by like a whole bunch of zeros, or a whole bunch of 1s followed by a couple of zeros after the decimal point. It doesn't matter where that point is, left or right, that's still a lot of digits it's got to keep track of. So, if you add a lot of decimal places without there needing to be, or alternatively, you build really far away from 0, 0, 0, so that the position of the model is a really high number, like 61,000, then you can start to notice some errors popping up. Let's fly really far away. In fact, let's do a little experiment, shall we? I'm going to grab a second version of this. I'm going to use part color. I'm going to change this to green. And I'm going to duplicate another one, and I'm going to make this one pink. Right now, what's happening is Z-fighting. If you don't know what Z-fighting is, it's when two objects are perfectly on top of each other. They perfectly are in line, so your renderer doesn't know which one to render first. This is good, for example, because we know that this pink thing is perfectly in line with the brown and the green brick. Let's grab all three of these, and let's drag them really far off into the distance. You'll start to notice that my camera is struggling to rotate. Right? It's like snapping into place. It's like really having a rough time. That's because my camera has a position of itself, and the orientation, how it rotates, also has a number. So the further away from 0, 0, 0 I get, the more floating point inaccuracies I'm introducing, because the numbers, it's like skipping numbers. It's like trying to rotate a cube 1 degrees, but you can only move in increments of 10. You're just going to completely skip over the increment you want. And because we're so far out, I can break this even further. Let's rotate this by 0, 0, 0. This thing is now really messed up. I'm going to press Control L to make sure that I'm moving it relative to itself. And we're going to go even further. We're going to keep going. Oh, Jesus. Yep, we're going to keep going. We're going to go really, really far. And then what we're going to do is we're going to group this together, and then we're going to set the group's position back to 0, 0, 0. Alright, we have returned. However, you might notice something off about this thing. You see how the pink is no longer Z-fighting with the brown? If we break up this model and move this away, the pink is still there, but the brown part has introduced, like, that's like 0.1 of a stud. It's snapped a whole complete distance away from the other part without me moving them. I was moving them together. You saw me moving them relative to each other, and yet because we were so far out, the brown part physically didn't have enough numbers in its floating point to be able to perfectly align with all the other parts. So I've accidentally created misalignments just because I abused the fact that I was using 0 stud increments, 0 degree rotations, and putting it really far away from 0, 0, 0. So if you're going to be doing any kind of unioning, I highly suggest you be a bit clever about it and just make sure you keep that stuff on the grid. Make sure that the position is nice before you do any unioning. For example, what's the position here? Yep, the position looks fine. There's no extraneous points. I'm quite close to 0, 0, 0, you know. I'm only like 212 studs away from 0, 0, 0, that's fine. So now we're going to do the same thing, and this time I'm going to set this to a sphere. Not a sphere, a cylinder. This time I'm going to hold Control, and I'm going to scale. And that's going to cause it to scale out like that, which is very handy. And I'm going to make sure that it overlaps on both sides, so that the floating point error, even if there was one, won't affect this particular union that I'm trying to create. And just as a rule of thumb, I like to make sure that my unions are as small as possible because they make them nice and easy to work with. So we're going to do that. We're going to negate it, and then we're going to union it. Perfect. Much better. And this is a much more usable union. Now, a thing about triangles that I do want to bring up before we move on is that even models where their triangles aren't fully visible are still being rendered. Rendering just means that your computer is taking the time to do all the math to calculate where all the points go, and then doing all the math to calculate where all the edges go, and then doing all the math to fill in the faces, right? Behind this wall, we have a gear. Now, this is a quite complicated union that I've created. In fact, if I turn on wireframe rendering under the View tab, you'll see that it is honestly quite horrendous. There is a lot of triangles that make up this union, but that's fine. It's for demonstration purposes. If I hide this behind this wall, it is still being rendered. All of those knobbly bits on the edge of that gear, even though I can't see anything, I just see a square of blue, they're still being rendered. All that information is still being rendered because I can still see the union. Doesn't matter how much of the union I can see. It doesn't matter if I could see just the edge of the gear. If this gear is a part of a giant model and I could only see one tooth of it, I still have to download and render the whole mesh, the whole union, to be able to keep track of the actual shape. The way rendering works is the stuff that's furthest away from the camera gets rendered first. Anything that's closer, for example, the blue gear is being rendered first. Well, actually, the terrain behind it is being rendered first. And then the blue gear is being rendered. And then the white wall is being rendered on top of it. And you don't see any of this because by the time it gets to your computer, it is a finished frame. And that frame is 1/60th of a second. Computers are wicked fast, okay? There's a few optimization features that I want to talk about. Culling is where the computer deliberately doesn't render something because it knows that it's not going to be visible. There's a couple of examples of this. One of the simplest versions of culling is Frustum Culling. Frustum Culling is essentially anything that's outside of the view of your camera is not being rendered. A frustum is this weird sort of square cone shape that comes out of the camera. Anything outside of that frustum doesn't get rendered. This is why when you want to find the try count of a map, you go to View and then you click Render. And this will give you a whole bunch of information here. Now, if you go down to, where does it say? It should say somewhere. Yeah, right, draw counts at the bottom. It tells you what it's drawing. That's why if you look at everything, it's telling you that there's, 449,700 triangles being rendered right now. But if I look away from it all, it drops down to 51 triangles. Now, the second type of culling that I want to talk about is backface culling. Of all the triangles that you can see on this model, you can only actually see 3 of the faces. This top face, this side face, and this front face, right? But these faces aren't being rendered, or at least they weren't when I was up here. If I turn on wireframe rendering, you can actually see that those back faces aren't being rendered. You would expect to see a line here, but no, it's disappeared. That's because I can't see that. That back face is not being rendered. So Roblox has Frustum Culling and it has Backface Culling, which is very nice. But you'll notice that some of the back faces on this union are actually still visible for some reason. And that's just because of how much of a mess this union is. Back faces are because every triangle that's visible on a model has to choose between which way it's facing. Is it facing towards you or is it facing away? Doesn't really matter. Whichever way it's facing, it only has one direction it faces. So the back face never gets rendered on a triangle, but backface culling is separate to that. Backface culling simply hides the triangles that are facing away from you, and it doesn't do any extra work to render them because they're not facing you and they're not visible. There's a final form of culling that I want to talk about, and this kind of culling is very important in the context of Archipelago. If we take this gear, for example, and you see how it's being rendered because it's behind this wall, let's cover it up, shall we? Now I can't see the gear, okay? So you would think the game engine would stop rendering the gear. Well, let's turn on wireframe rendering and see. Oh no. The gear is still being rendered. This is how Roblox has worked for years and years and years. Anything that was behind anything else, it doesn't matter how far away it was, if it was within your render distance, graphics setting 1 or graphics setting 10, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's behind something else, it was being rendered. Until a few months ago. Roblox added this brand new feature, and I say brand new, it's been in video games since the dawn of time, and it's surprising that it's taken Roblox this long to add, but Roblox added a new feature called Occlusion Culling. Occlusion Culling means if an object is occluded, such as being hidden behind a wall, then it won't be rendered anymore. So why is this gear still being rendered? Well, that's because this wall is quite thin. If I actually make this wall thicker, all of a sudden, everything disappears behind it. They're still there, and in fact you see them pop back into view when I fly around it, but if the wall's thick enough, then stuff stops getting rendered. Perfect, right? Now the problem with Occlusion Culling is that it doesn't work with a few things. For example, if you see this terrain, and I go behind it, everything behind that terrain is still being rendered. Terrain does not occlude anything, which is a shame, because if we go back to Archipelago, you can still see everything through the walls of the map. I can see right the way into Cafe, I can see into here, but you'll actually notice that this whole area here, like the servers and the top and that, actually start to disappear when I'm in Cafe. Like, you can see the shape of the cave, but if I move over here, all of a sudden all that stuff's being rendered, and then I go behind a wall and it disappears. That's because the terrain isn't hiding it, but the walls of the cafe are. Which is really funny to me, because if I stand over here, I'm rendering cafe, or at least I would be if it wasn't for this shed that's in the way that's helping occlude the cafe behind the terrain. Right, so what's the next problem with unions? Well, the next problem that you can get with unions is instancing. Every time you create a new union, you create a new collision ID and a new mesh ID, and both of those get stored on the Roblox database. So, anytime a player wants to download your world, they have to then download your union's mesh ID and collision ID off of Roblox CDN. It just means that their loading time will be a little bit longer depending on how big the union is. A lot longer if there's a lot of unions. For example, let's head over to this side of the map, right? You notice something different about this union here? Notice how it's a little bit shorter? Let's drag it over. Let's drag it over to the other one, shall we? And let's see. Oh, okay, that's a little bit shorter than the other one. Okay, what about, I don't know, this union here? Oh wait, this one's a little bit taller than the other ones. What's happened here is I have created multiple different unions that all do the exact same function. Yeah, this one's a different color, but you can change the color of unions by just clicking use part color and then changing the color of it up here. So I didn't need to create a new union for this. I should have just used the same union. The problem with using multiple different unions that all do the exact same thing is that all of these need to be downloaded separately. All of their collision IDs need to be downloaded separately, and it creates a lot of extra loading time for your game. So what I should have instead done is take this first union and duplicate it. If we put this union back where it belongs, and press Control D. Control D creates a duplicate. Now, you might not notice that anything's happened, but if you actually drag this out, you'll notice that I've created a duplicate. Let's do it again. Control D, Control D, Control D. These are all the exact same union. They're using the same mesh ID and the same collision ID. So if I was to paste these everywhere, so let's say I take this guy and I drag him all the way over to here, for example, and then we're going to change the color. Bam, perfect. You wouldn't even notice that anything was different. If I was to duplicate and do that for every single window on the map, I've eliminated a whole bunch of unnecessary unions that you need to download off the Roblox database. No longer do you need to download a bunch of random copies of each other. You just need to download the one union, and once that one union is downloaded, its mesh ID and collision ID gets automatically pasted everywhere on the map, and you only need to keep track of that one union. An overabundance of unions like that can cause problems. For example, if you've ever played Monsoon and the roof of the gun store room has disappeared for you, the reason why that happened is because that roof is a union. So if you are having a particularly long loading time and that roof doesn't load in time and you just spawn into the map, you'll still get the collision ID, the collision will still work, but you won't have gained the mesh ID. So you'll just be looking at this invisible roof, wondering why your bullets are being blocked by some invisible object. If that's ever happened to you in a map, that's the reason why. And this carries on neatly to our fourth point that unions are bad. Network usage. Unions need to be constantly stored in your RAM. So does everything else on your map, of course, but again, if you have a whole bunch of random unions or really complicated unions with a lot of triangles or a really weird collision, then you need to keep track of all of that in your RAM. And if you don't have a lot of RAM, then you can cause problems. Now, that's if you have like less than 4 gigabytes, and most people have more than 4 gigabytes. This is the modern era, so it really should be fine. But if you've got a really big build with a lot of random unions all over the place, and a lot of them are unnecessary, then that might be where a lot of your lag is coming from. You never know. So, with all of these negatives shown, you might start to understand why people suggest to use meshes over unions instead, right? Well, here's the problem. Meshes have the same problems. Just because something is a mesh doesn't necessarily mean it has better collision. You can have meshes that have the exact same weird collision problems as unions, which can be fixed the same way as unions by just changing the collision ID to either hull or precise convex decomposition. As I've shown in my Archipelago version 2.3 video, meshes can also have unnecessary tries. The biggest lag issue on this map was meshes. As you can see, these cones are so triangle dense that they look solid from afar. You can see through the rest of the map, but the trees are completely solid until you get close enough to see the whopping 560 odd tries it was. I still don't know why. Like, why is there a line here? It just doubled the amount of meshes just by adding a single loop cut in the middle of it. Ooh, especially the top face. Look at it. Look at how many triangles there are. Meshes can be just as bad as unions in terms of their topology if you're not keeping track of the wireframe by using wireframe rendering to see it. And same as unions, having multiple different instances of meshes can also cause lag. Meshes still need to be downloaded, and they still need their mesh ID downloaded, they still need their collision ID downloaded, and they still need to be stored in RAM. Here we have 3 parts in front of us. This is a part, this is a union, and this is a mesh. If we go to collision view, you'll see that their collision, they're about the same as each other. And if we go and turn on wireframe rendering, you'll see that their wireframes are the same as well. This is a union. I can even prove it right now by separating it, you see? But all 3 of these look the exact same. The thing is though, in terms of the performance of all of these, the part is going to be supreme, because the part is already kept in your RAM because parts are used in every single Roblox instance ever. It's super lightweight, Roblox knows how to calculate it ultra fast, there's no mesh ID or anything you need to download, the collision is always going to be the same. Parts are perfect. You can build a world out of hundreds of thousands of parts and be completely fine. Meanwhile, the mesh and the union, they need their collision ID downloaded, they need all of this information downloaded, they need to be, checked for collision and everything. So there's no inherent reason to use meshes over unions, right? Well, there is one more reason, and that's probably the big difference. Component data. If I go back to this union from before and separate it, the game isn't just keeping track of the final mesh. It is also keeping track of the negated part that made that mesh. So for example, if we head back to this monstrosity, this union is keeping track of all of these different negative parts that made up that union. Of course it needs to do that. It needs to do that to know what shape it looks like, right? So that's a lot of extra memory that's being stored on parts that you can't see because they're invisible. All this extra space that the negative part takes up doesn't matter, still being calculated. I actually lied about this union a bit earlier. There's something quite horrific about this. If I turn off the negative part of this and then separate this, this is actually a union itself. A union made up of multiple negative parts. Like this. That's because unions not only keep track of the negative part that made them, but if a union is then used to make another union, that union's parts are being tracked as well. So this part is keeping track of one part, which is keeping track of 3 parts. And if you've spotted, these are unions too. And all of them are made up of a ton of negative parts as well. So even though, if I undo all of this that I did, even though this part looks really innocuous because of the component data, that means all the negative parts and all the primitives that we use to create it, all of that is being stored in this union that the mesh isn't storing, because the mesh was just imported into Roblox. It doesn't care how the mesh was made, it just knows that it's a mesh. It's like, okay, cool, this is the shape, this is the collision, have fun with it. With the union, it's got to keep track of all this extra information. And that might be the number one reason to not use unions. So, should you stop using unions? Honestly, no. If unions are something that's easy for you to work with and you know how to use them, keep using them. But use these new tools that I have shown you, such as wireframe rendering to check the triangles, and show decomposition geometry to see the collision, and you should honestly be fine with most of the faults that come with unions. But I still suggest you should go out and learn Blender. Which is why I'm going to teach you Blender right now. Actually, I'm not going to be teaching you right now. I'll be teaching you next week. This is Editing Kai. Hello. I've been at this all day, and the video has gotten really long. This is all the footage I've edited. This is all the footage I have left to edit. So we're going to be doing this next week. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hopefully it demystifies some of the weird stuff about unions. I'd like to stress that I'm not an expert on the subject, and I am still learning myself. So there's quite a lot of things that I may have gotten wrong in this video. I'm still not sure if component data is or is not a thing, but I was told about it by Hoonty, and I have no reason to disbelieve him. But if any experts in the comments can pop up, that would be very nice. The moral of the story is the Roblox engine isn't going to crash and burn because you used a couple of unions. Games use unions all the time, so don't build this fear of using the tools that are available to you because people tell you they are bad. That's ultimately what the point of this video is about. Unions are a tool, and like any tool, they can be used badly or they can be used well. So go ahead and use unions wherever you like. I'm going to be getting into more of the nitty-gritty of optimization in the optimization and Blender video that I'm going to be making next week. But for the time being, go ahead and use unions as much as you like. If you want to spend a bit of time learning Blender too, that's always great. But if you don't want to do that right now, don't worry. A video will be coming out next week. Hopefully it won't be too ridiculously long. I feel like there's a lot of hemming and hawing I can cut out of this video. But if you enjoyed the video, give a like and subscribe. And if you aren't here from Traitor Town, welcome. Welcome. And if you aren't here from Traitor Town, and if you aren't here from the Traitor Town,